Okay, today's daf is Kuf Mem Bet. We're going to start on Kuf Mem Aleph Amud Bet with the new Perek Notel. Notel Adam et Beno. The new Mishnah says a man can carry his son ve'even biado, even though the child is carrying something that's muktzeh. So here we're dealing with muktzeh, hilchot muktzeh, but not direct carrying somebody who's holding something muktzeh. This comes up all the time when a child is holding an object that is muktzeh, but you want to pick him up. This is not talking about carrying in a public domain. We're just talking about the muktzeh issue here. And you can pick up a basket even though there's a rock inside. Now obviously we're talking about a basket that has fruit or something like that, and also has a rock inside. And if you have a basket that has terumat teme'ah, impure terumah, which has no utility on Shabbat, because the only thing that you can do with impure terumah is burn it. So clearly it has no utility, it's muktzeh. But since the basket contains both pure and impure terumah, you're allowed to carry it. Vimachulin. So if you either have impure terumah together with pure terumah, or impure terumah together with chulin, mundane, regular, ordinary produce, you can carry it. You can move it around. It's not muktzeh because it's a mix of muktzeh and non-muktzeh together. Rabbi Yehuda Omer af ma'alinata miduma be'achad u'me'ah. This actually has nothing directly to do with this Mishnah, except that it deals with terumah. What it means is that we know that if terumah falls, and generally in kashrut, if a non-kosher item falls into kosher, so we know that it's batel b'shishim, which means if you have 60 times kasher against the non-kosher, so then you have, it's okay. In terumah, the measurement is echad b'me'ah, 1 in 100. But the rabbis made a takana that you still have to take a portion out for the kohen, because let's say you had terumah and it fell into your pot of dafina, whatever. You fell into your pot of soup, and now it's mixed. You're not going to be able to extract the soup that was terumah from the soup that's chulin. So what do? Now it's batel because there was 100 times regular soup against the terumah. So now what ends up happening is that the kohanim lose because you're not going to have to give them that portion. Now from a kashrut, in other words, there are two issues. One issue is the kashrut issue, which is, are you allowed to eat it as a non-kohen? And the other issue is, are you jipping the kohen? So from the perspective of your kashrut, you can eat it, but the problem is you owe the kohen a portion. So the rabbis they made a takana that in order to eat that, you still have to separate out the portion, a quantity equal to the portion that fell in of trumah. So now, in other words, the trumah fell in. Right. You're not going to be able to figure out which part is actually the trumah, but you know that it's less than let's say it was a certain quantity, and that quantity is less than 1% of the total. So you can eat that, but you have to first separate out an amount equal to the amount of trumah that fell in and actually give it to the kohen, because otherwise from the mixture, because otherwise you lost. The kohen lost. So you have to take out an equivalent amount. So even though you can't discern what's really the trumah and what isn't, you have to at least take out a part equivalent to the amount of trumah that you would owe the kohen and give it to him. It's unlike kashrut, because in kashrut you don't owe that to anybody. Let's say a little bit of meat falls into milk, so as long as it's less than 1/60th, you're okay, and you don't have to take an amount out and give it to somebody because it doesn't belong to anybody. Here you have a separate obligation. So we're going to see more about that in a second. In other words, the chidush is the reason why Rabbi Yehuda is mentioning that is because you might have thought that it's a tikkun, you're repairing the food. Normally you can't separate terumah and maaser on Shabbat because you're fixing the food. You're making it edible. So here we're saying it's not an issue, and we'll see why that is as we move forward. The Gemara says, Amar Rava says, v'kis taloi betzavaro chayav mishum kis. This is a little bit morbid. Rava says, if you take out, now we're talking about actually carrying on Shabbat. We're talking about moving a child from the private to the public domain. Hotzi means you took it out. Okay, that's unlike notel. The language of the Mishnah, notel means just to hold the child. Now we're talking about carrying. So if you move the child from a private domain to the public domain, and the child has a kis, he has some kind of a purse around his neck, you are chayav because of the purse. In other words, you're not chayav for moving the child. And we should remember that the principle of chai noset atzmo, that carrying a living child is only rabbinically prohibited. So, carrying it from private to a public domain. But you're liable for the kis, for the wallet or the pouch of money that's on the child. Tinok met, but if you're carrying a dead child out, if a child passes away, God forbid, it's a terrible situation. But halachically, we still have to deal with it. V'kis talui lo b'tzavaro, and he has a purse hanging around his neck, so then patur, he is exempt. We'll see why in a minute. So tinok chay v'kis talui lo b'tzavaro chayav mishum kis v'lechayev nami mishum tinok. Why is it that a child, if you carry a living child out and he has a purse around his neck, that you're only chayav, you're only liable for carrying the purse? Why are you not liable for carrying the child? Well, this is because Ravakir Rabbi Natan sevira leida amar chay noseh et atzmo, because Rava follows the position of Rabbi Natan, who said chay noseh et atzmo, carrying a living child. We look at the child as if he carries himself. Because we know dead weight literally is heavier than light weight, because when you are than living weight, because when the child's alive, to a certain extent, a living person is lighter. Okay, so that's why we say chay noseh et atzmo. He participates in his own carrying. V'liftil kis legabe tinok. Why don't we look at the kis, the pouch, as subsidiary to the child? So just like, let's say, if you carried a child who's alive and he has clothing on, we don't say that you carried the clothing. So why do we say you're carrying the purse? That if you carry out a living person on a bed, you're exempt even regarding the bed, because the mitah, the bed, is subordinate to the person. In other words, you're carrying the bed out in order to carry the person. So why don't we say the same thing here, that since it's attached to him, it's part of him, it's not a separate carrying that you're doing on the purse. So the Gemara says, answer is mita legabe chay mivatlele, kis legabe tinok lo mivatlele. Let's be honest. When you carry out the bed to carry the person, you wouldn't be carrying out the bed without the person. The bed is only functional in that case. But the kis, the purse that has money in it, you are attached to the money independently of the child. So when you carry out the child that also happens to be carrying money, you're thinking about the money too. So it's an independent, it's like you're carrying two objects. We don't look at that kis, we don't look at that pouch of money as subordinate to the child. And then we said tinok met v'kis talui lo b'tzavro patur v'lechayev mishum tinok. Why is it that when you carry out a dead child with the money attached to it, that you're exempt on everything? So v'lechayev mishum tinok. Why are you not chayav? Why are you not liable for carrying out the baby? Because in that case, the baby's not alive, so we can't say chay noseh et atzmo. We can't say that the child's carrying himself. So Rabbi Shimon, because we know the general principle that Rabbi Shimon holds, that any melacha that you do that's not for a constructive purpose, but is to remove a problem, it's not constructive, is exempt. So here too, moving a child out, why are you removing a body from a house? You're removing it because you don't want it in the house, not because you do want it somewhere else. Okay, that's the assumption. Now obviously if you were taking it out because you wanted it outside for some reason, that would not be a case of melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. But we're assuming that that's the case generally. That's the classic case of removing something from the house. So now of course the question is, what about the kis in that case? What about the pouch around his neck? What about the purse? Why are you not liable for the purse? So Rashi preempts this issue. The Gemara doesn't actually directly address it, because before we said that the kis is not looked at as subordinate to the child. You're independently attached to the purse. So why here don't we say the same thing? Why don't we say the same thing? Don't you care about the money? So the answer that Rashi says is v'kis shehaya talui b'tzavaro l'sachek bo agav mirare mivatel legabe tinok. Because why is the child wearing your purse around his neck? Because he was playing with it, and now because you're so saddened at the death of the child, you're not thinking about it at that time. Isn't that interesting? So he says, agav mirare, because of bitterness. In other words, you're so upset. Mivatel legabe tinok shemet velo chashiv lehahishata. And at that point, you're not thinking about it. Who's thinking about money when you have a child that passed away, right? So you're thinking only about the money as subordinate, as an aspect of the child. You're not thinking of it independently. Whereas when the child's alive, you can think of money and the child at the same time. I think that psychologically, there's probably a great deal of truth to that.
I would have thought that would have been kavod hamed also, because once you start taking off the keys, then you got to think about taking off the hat and taking off the shirt,
other things,
taking off the pants.
Yeah.
And, at what point, you're gonna be violating kavod hamed. Mm-hmm. I'm so surprised.
You could also think of it. You could also think of it that way. Yeah, you could also think of it that way, I guess. But this is an interesting way of looking at it, the way that he does present it, more on a psychological level. How are you relating to it at that moment? So now this didn't directly address our concern so far, because our concern was is really about muktzeh. This Mishnah is really what's being cited here from Rava is really about carrying out on Shabbat. But still, the principle is that when you carry a child and he's carrying something else, as in this case, you carry the child and there's something around his neck, you are liable as if you carried that. Okay, that's the chidush. So similar to so then the question is, of course, going to come up. Tenan, notel adam et beno ve'even biyado. In our Mishnah, it says you can carry the child you can pick up your child who's carrying something muktzeh, he's carrying a rock. So why is it not the same when you carry a child out and he has a purse around his neck? You're considered to be liable for that. Why are you not liable? In other words, in this case, for picking up the child, you should be also considered picking up the muktzeh, since it seems like the child becomes an extension of you in terms of what it's carrying. Amrei devei Rabbi Yanai, the yeshiva of Rabbi Yanai said, "Betinok sheyesh lo giaguin alaviv." We're talking about a child who is sick for his father. In other words, a child desperately wants to be picked up. We've all seen this before. The child is having a tantrum beyond normal proportions and will sicken himself and start, we've probably all seen children who literally become sick. Like they'll literally start throwing up or get ill because they're crying so much, they're having such a tantrum, they want to be picked up. So when a child is having the tantrum of the century, you're allowed to pick them up even though they're holding muktzeh. Now if they're just whining a little, Dad, pick me up. Okay, say, listen, I can't pick you up right now, and usually that's okay. But when they're going nuts over it, that's where you're allowed to pick them up. That's giaguin. He's really yearning for his pining for the father, I think would be the word that we'd use in English probably, right? So ihachi, if that's the case, my irya even, why does our Mishnah specify that he's holding a rock? Afilu dinar nami, even if he's holding money, you should be able to pick him up. Alama amar Rava, why did Rava say, lo shanu ela even about dinar asur? Why is it that Rava came along and told us that no, the Mishnah is specific here. It says you can only pick up the child if he's holding a rock, not if he's holding a coin. A coin, you're not, even if he's screaming on the floor, you're not allowed to. Even if he's going to get ill, you're not allowed to. Now, obviously, if he's endangered, Rashi says, obviously, that's a different question. We're not talking about danger. We're talking about he's just going to be ill over it if you're not going to let him. Okay? So why can't you pick him up when he's holding the coin? Dinar inafil. The problem is that if the child is holding a rock and he drops it, you're going to say, good riddance to that annoying rock, I didn't want it anyway. But if he drops a coin, wait a second, he just dropped a gold coin, a dinar, you're not going to be so quick. Maybe a penny, but anything more than anything, it's really significant money, you're not going to allow it to just drop on the floor like that. So therefore you might pick it up, and that's a separate concern, and that's why we differentiate between where he's holding something of real value that's muktzeh. You can't pick him up because if he drops it, you're going to pick up the muktzeh thing yourself. Now one thing you could do is tell the child, hey, put that muktzeh thing over there and I'll pick you up, and that would be okay. That's a solution, a practical solution to get out of it. And when I've been in situations where I've had this, which I'm sure all parents have, I just tell them, well, I can't pick you up when you're holding that, but if you would put that over there, I can pick you up, and usually the child will respond. Okay, Tanya Kivati, there's a bright in accordance with Rava. This goes back to what he said before, not about muktzeh, but again about carrying. That there's a difference when an object or when an accessory is attached to the person versus when they're carrying it. If you carry your kelim, you carry your various accessories is the best word, folded up on your shoulder, and you have your sandals and your rings in your hand, chayav, of course, you're liable for that. But if you're wearing the very same things, it's fine, obviously. Accessories you're wearing it. And similarly, if you carry a person out and they're wearing every accessory, it's fine. They're wearing the accessories, so all the accessories are subordinate to the person. It's not like you're carrying them out separately. However, if you were to carry them out as they are, in other words, that you pick up a child who is holding his rings or his sandals in his hand, then you're considered to be carrying the sandals and the rings separately. Just like if you carried out your own sandals and rings, you wouldn't be allowed to. But if you were wearing them, you would be allowed to. So the point here is that just like you can wear accessories, but you can't carry accessories, if you carried somebody who's wearing accessories, you're not liable. But if they were carrying the accessories, you would be liable.
So a person is not considered an accessory?
The person himself?
The purse.
Oh, the purse. The purse, I guess, wasn't considered an accessory because it's not really clothing.
Okay.
It's hanging around his neck, but I guess normally you would carry it.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess that's the point. So now we said like this: if you have a basket with a rock inside, you're allowed to move it. So why is that? Generally, we say that if you place something on something, like we talked about many times before, a muktzeh item is placed on a table. The table can become a basis. It becomes a grounding, a basis, literally a base for davar hasur, for a forbidden thing, and it becomes muktzeh itself. So if the basket has a rock in it, why are you allowed to move the basket? The basket has a rock in it, so the basket became a basis. It became a base for the muktzeh item, and therefore it itself should be muktzeh anyway. So the Gemara answers, Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, now I actually preempted this when I explained the Mishnah, so we already kind of knew this, but it's talking about a basket full of fruit with a rock in it. So since it's full of fruit, it's not primarily, we don't look at the basket and say, oh, that's a basket which is a base for the rock. We say that's a basket of fruit that happens to have a rock in it. So that's why you're allowed to move it. So the Gemara asks, but wait a second, why don't you just dump out the fruit and the rock? And that way you don't have to carry the fruit and the rock. You just tilt it, the rock and the fruit will fall out. And then you can pick up the fruit by itself, put it back in the basket, and you don't have to have the rock there. Why are you allowing yourself to move the basket with the rock and the fruit at the same time? You shouldn't allow yourself to do that. So the Gemara answers, because Rabbi Eli, it's like Rabbi Eli said, Amar Rav, in the name of Rav, Ba'perot mitanfin, that it's talking about fruit that will get ruined if you spill it out, like berries or grapes. If you spill them out, they're going to get ruined. Easily ruined. So therefore, you can't spill them out without ruining them, and therefore you're forced to move the basket with both the rock and the fruit inside. Hachinami here too. Hachanami, it's here too. But perot hamitanfin, we're talking about fruit that will be ruined. Velin ar'inho na'urei. But still, why can't we just shake the basket, move everything to one side? In other words, move all without spilling out the fruit, and then shake the rock by itself out. In other words, why can't we shuffle it around and shuffle the rock out without spilling out all of the fruit? That should be a valid solution. Amar Rav Chia, Amar Rav Bar Ashi, Amar Rava. Rav Chia Bar Ashi said that Rava said, you know what? Let's revise. Now, according to Rashi and Tosafot, this is a revision of the answer. In other words, we're rejecting the answer that this was a basket full of fruit that had a rock mixed in with the fruit, because if that were the case, according to Rashi and Tosafot here, you would have to try to use a tahbula, use some kind of a strategy to get the rock out indirectly and then take the fruit. But we're talking about a case where this basket was actually broken and you fixed the basket by sticking a rock in the bottom so that it wouldn't leak out the bottom. So the rock is actually part of the kalkala, it's part of the basket. That's why. The point is that since you made the rock part of the basket, even though the rock by itself would be muktzeh, and it's really a makeshift solution, but since you stuck it in there and it became part of the wall of the basket, now you're allowed to use it. However, the Rambam obviously had a different girsah, he had a different text of the Gemara where this isn't a rejection of the previous answer, but it's actually an addition to the previous answer, which is if you can shake out the rock without ruining the fruits, that's what you should do. Or if you can pour out the rock with the fruit and then take the fruits back in the basket, that's what you should do. And if not, if you're dealing with, in other words, and then you can actually carry the berries with the rock, because you're not able to take one away from the other. You're not able to tilt it in such a way without ruining the fruit. And in addition, if the rock was part of the wall of the basket, you could also carry it. So he actually interprets it as two answers. There are two cases where you'd be able to carry the basket with the rock. One is where the basket is, the rock is actually part of the basket, and the other one is where there's no way to remove the rock without ruining the fruit. Basically, that's what the Gemara says. So now we get to this case of the teruma, where we said you can move teruma with pure teruma with impure teruma. And of course, again, the problem with impure teruma is that impure teruma has no functionality, has no utility on Shabbat, because it can only be burnt. It can't be used, not even by a kohen. Amar Rav Chisda says, "Lo shanu ela shetorah lemata utmea lemala." The only time you can carry the pure and impure teruma together is when the impure teruma is on the top. Aval tehora lemala utmea lemata shakil le'letorah v'shavik le'letmea. But if you have a situation where the pure teruma is on top and the impure teruma is on the bottom, why do you have to carry them both together in the basket? Just take the pure off. Just take the pure off the top. No, this is not that one. This is a basket, let's say, that has impure truma on the bottom, pure truma on the top. So Rav Chizda says, just take the truma from the top. Why do you have to move the whole basket? Take off the pure truma, put it in another container. Okay, so the Gemara says, "V'chi tehora lemata nami lishdinhu v'lin kitnu." I'm sorry, did I skip a part? V'chi tehora lemata nami lishdinhu v'lin kitnu. So the Gemara asks, but even if the pure is on the bottom and the impure is on the top, why can't you spill the impure fruits out? Like we said before about the rock, why can't you just tilt it so that the impure teruma falls out? Now you just have a basket with pure teruma. Amar Rabbi Eli said that Rav said about perot hamitanfin askinan, again, that this is talking about fruits that will be easily ruined. So Rav Chizda is saying like this: if the teruma is on the top, and the good teruma is on the top, and the bad teruma is on the bottom, just take the good off the top. You don't need to carry the basket with the impure teruma that's muktzeh. You don't have to. If the impure teruma is on the top and the impure is on the bottom, where you really have no choice, but to move the entire thing. So there, it depends. If you can spill it out, you can spill the impure teruma out so that you don't have to. So you can avoid actually carrying the impure teruma around. So then you do that. But if it's teruma, if it's of a type of fruit that's going to be ruined, so then you can carry them together. That is what the Gemara concludes about this case. But now it's going to ask an objection here. That there is an objection ben problem for Rav Chizda, because there's a clear statement in a Braita that you can move the pure and impure teruma together, or the impure teruma together with the chulin, with the mundane, non-sacred produce, whether the pure is on top and the impure is on the bottom, or the impure is on top and the pure is on the bottom. In other words, what Rav Chizda said, which was that you could just remove the pure from what's on top. If the pure is on top, you should just be able to take it, is not true, because it's saying you don't have to do that. You don't have to take it. You can move the whole basket. To Yuftad Rav Chizda, this seems to refute Rav Chizda. Amar lach Rav Chizda will say, no, matnitin letorach gufo, b'raita letorach mekomo. There's a difference, because that b'raita is talking about where you needed it letorach mekomo. There's a difference here, a big difference, because there's two reasons why you might move this basket that has both the pure and impure teruma in it. One reason you might move it is because you need the pure teruma. If you need the pure teruma, and the pure teruma is on the top, why do you need to move the whole basket? Just take what's on top. But the other reason you might need to move this basket is because litzorech mikomo, because it's on the table and you need to move it off the table because you want to eat there. You need the place that it's occupying. So then it doesn't help you to just take the pure teruma out of the basket, because the basket's still sitting on the table. So we said, well, the Braita is talking about a case where you need the space that it's occupying. So just taking the pure out will not help you. Okay, but I'm talking about a case, and our Mishnah is talking about a case where you want to use the pure teruma. That's why you're moving it. And since you want to move the pure teruma, taking it off the top is enough. So how does Rav Chizda come up with the idea that our Mishnah is specifically talking about a case where you need to use the teruma? Amar Rava says, actually, it's very accurate that way. It fits well that way. Because in the next Mishnah, which is really the conclusion of this Mishnah, it says, Ma'ot shalakar. Because it says that a pillow that has money left on it, you can shake the pillow and the money will fall off. That case of the pillow that has the money on it, Rabbi Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said that the only time that you have to shake it to get the money off is when you want to lie on the pillow. You want to use the pillow. But when you're moving the pillow because you need the space, somebody left the pillow in a place where it's inconvenient and you need the spot, then you can move it even with the money on it. Okay? Because then it's not the pillow that you want to use, it's the space under it that you want to use. Okay, and just like that Mishnah that said that you have to shake the money off the pillow is only talking about where you want to use the pillow, so too our Mishnah that says you can move the basket with the truma that's impure and pure is talking about where you want to use the pure truma. Now, why is there a difference between where you're moving it because you want to use it and where you're moving it because you need the space? Basically because when you're moving it because you want to use it, really you don't need to be involved with the muktzeh aspect at all. You don't need to be involved with it at all. But when you need the space that it's occupying, even the muktzeh thing, there's a license to move it. Because you're allowed to move a muktzeh thing to use the space that it occupies. So in the case where the pillow has money on it, or the basket has impure and pure, and you need the space under it, in those cases you can move both the muktzeh thing and the non-muktzeh thing because you need the space, and even the muktzeh thing would be able to be moved in that case because it's something that you're allowed to move l'tzorach mikomo. But when you just need when you need the non-muktzeh thing, why do you have to be involved with the muktzeh thing at all? So that's why there's a difference Rav Chisda is making here, a differentiation here. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer Af Ma'alin. Now we get to the Terumah case. Now we're talking about the case where the Terumah gets mixed in with Chulin. So the Terumah. So Rabbi Yehuda said that if you have Terumah that's mixed in with Chulin, and you have the 1 out of 100 ratio, which means that it's kosher for consumption, but you still have to give that percentage to the Kohen, and the rabbis didn't allow you to eat that mixture that has 1% Terumah in it, or less than 1% Terumah in it, until you give a proportion of it to the Kohen. He said that separating that on Shabbat is not considered a tikkun. It's not considered fixing the food. Like normally separating Maser or separating Trumah would be considered fixing the food, and you can't do it on Shabbat.
If the Kohen can eat the mixture with impure Trumah.
It's not impure, this is pure. We're talking about pure, but you're not a Kohen, so you can't eat it unless there's a ratio of 100 to 1.
Right, so you've got that 100 to 1.
Right.
And before you can eat it, you have to give the Kohen his cut.
Right.
A cut.
A cut, right.
What's the Kohen doing eating that mixture that contains impure Trumah?
It's not impure. It's pure. In other words, you separated out pure Trumah. You separated out pure Trumah. Yeah. And somebody came and didn't realize what it was and put some of it into your regular. Put in chulin. It's not impure. We're assuming pure. Yeah, because the impure, you're right. You couldn't eat that. He wouldn't be able to eat that. Now Rabbi Yehuda says it's not a tikkun. So why are you allowed to separate this out? Hakam itaken. He's fixing it because before he wasn't allowed to eat it. Now he's allowed to eat it. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eliezer, Svirale. Now it's going to try multiple texts here to try to figure out what is the basis for Rabbi Yehuda's lenient position. It's going to try a few different approaches. First, it says it must be holds like Rabbi Eliezer. What's Rabbi Eliezer? That Amar Terumah be'ena machta. Because according to Rabbi Eliezer, Terumah sits by itself. In other words, we look at the Terumah. When the Terumah falls into chulin, it falls into the non-sacred produce. We don't look at it as intermingled with that produce. We envision it as if it stands alone. So let's see how that plays out here. So it's Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah. Terumah shenafla lepachot mime'ah. If terumah fell into less than 100, v'nidme'u, and now nidme'u is the verb for basically becomes prohibited. Okay, it becomes prohibited because of terumah, because the amount of terumah that fell in was more than 1% of the what it fell into. V'nafal min hamidumah lemakom acher, and now even worse. So first, some terumah fell in, and there was less than 100 times in the pot. And then some from that pot fell in to another thing. Oh, so now we have another problem, right? And now there is less than 100 in that pot too. So in other words, so a certain amount fell into pot 1. Then that same amount fell into pot number 2, from pot number 1 to pot number 2. And again, there was less than 100 times. So in the worst case scenario, you have, let's say, I'm just making it up. So a gram fell into to pot number 1 of terumah, fell into pot number 1, and pot number 1 only 50 grams, so it wasn't enough. So now you take now really it's volume, but I'm just I'm using it as an example. So now you take 1 gram of that, which was now prohibited, fell into another pot that only had 50 grams in it. So now what's the problem? Now in the worst case scenario, the 1 gram that fell from pot A to pot B was actually the original terumah. But most likely it's not, but let's say it could be. Now what do you do? So what happens is that the Chachamim say, so Rabbi Eliezer says, you know what? We envision that gram that fell from pot A to pot B as if it was the original gram of terumah that fell into pot A, and now pot B is just as prohibited as pot A.
So it didn't distribute.
It didn't distribute. No, we just look at it that just like 1 gram into 50 is 1/50th, right? So we're going to say that the amount, now when the 1 gram fell in from Pat A to Pat B, we're going to say 1/50th of the 1 gram is Terumah. And if there's enough against that in the next pot, we're going to say it's allowed. So if there's 50 grams, for sure it would be good. Okay, so that's the way that the Chachamim go. But what does Rabbi Eliezer say? He says that once Terumah falls into the pot, we don't look at it that it intermingled. The rabbis say it intermingled, and now we look at it proportionally. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, there's an entity of Terumah in there. And maybe the entity that fell into pot B was the entity of Terumah. So he holds that it's separate. So what is the Gemara arguing here? The Gemara is arguing here that maybe our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda, is saying the same thing. That why is it that when you take out the portion for the Kohen, it's not considered a tikkun? It's not considered fixing your pot? Because, and now remember, if it had fallen into a pot that had less than 100 times the amount that fell in, you wouldn't be able to fix it by taking a piece out. We're only talking about where there was enough in the pot, that the pot didn't become prohibited, but you have a separate obligation. They have to separate a piece and give it to the Kohen. So, according to Rabbi Eliezer, we envision the Terumah being in there as a separate entity. So maybe that's why Rabbi Yehuda is allowing you, because he says you can take the piece, because we imagine as if that piece was a separate entity in there. We don't look at it as you're fixing it. It's as if it was separate all along. You didn't really do anything. So the Gemara says, no, that Eimar de Shamat le Chumra lekulami Shamat le. Rabbi Eliezer is being stringent. He's saying that we're stringent with respect to the Terumah, and we envision it, the worst case scenario, that the piece that you took out that fell from pot A to pot B is the same original piece of Terumah, or quantity of Terumah. But here you're using it as a leniency. You're saying because we envision it as a separate entity of Terumah, therefore when you separate it, we're not going to consider that a tikkun on Shabbat. We're not going to consider you fixing the pot. That's a leniency. Who said that we can apply it as a leniency? So we can't use that. So the El Lahuda Mark Rabbi Shimon. So we're going to try number 2. Strike 2. Okay? Rabbi Shimon says, maybe it's that Rabbi Yehuda follows Rabbi Shimon. As we learned in the Mishnah, okay, you have trouble here. So you had a sa'ah of Terumah that fell into 100 sa'ah. So that's good. 100 to 1. Should be okay. But the only problem was that another one fell in. So sa'ah number 1 fell into the 100, and you'd say, okay, batel b'me'ah. Right? It's 100 nullified. Second one falls in. You could say, okay, no, nullified again. Right? Because the first 100 nullified the 1. The 1 becomes nullified now. Now the other one comes in. It also gets nullified. However, harezo asura, the rabbis say no. Because since before you had a chance to take it out, because remember, when that 1 sa'ah fell into the 100, what do you have to do? True, the 100 doesn't become prohibited, but you still have to take 1 sa'ah out of the 101 and give it to a Kohen, right? And you didn't do that before the second sa'ah fell in, and now you have 102. So now we have to look at it as if 2 sa'ah fell into 100, and now you have a problem. Okay, but Rabbi Shimon says no. Rabbi Shimon Batir. Rabbi Shimon says no. When the 1 fell into the 100, and now you have 101, we look at it as 100 plus an extra 1 that's nullified. When the second one falls in, we say 100 plus another 1 that's nullified. We separate them out. So we're not looking at it as blended. We're looking at it as separated. So we don't consider the 2 as combined that fell in. Even though you didn't have a chance to separate a sa'ah out before the second sa'ah fell in, still we don't look at it as combined, we look at it as separated out. We look at it as 100 plus 1, then 100 plus another 1. Okay, so therefore, same thing here. Rabbi Yehuda would say that Terumah floating around in there, we look at it as a separate entity, and therefore when you take it out on Shabbat, we don't conceive of it as fixing this mixture, because we imagine that piece of Terumah, that quantity of Terumah was always separate from the mixture in theory, even though in practice it was combined. So Umimai again, maybe he only argues over there. Rabbi Shimon de Tanaka masavar afal gav de naflu bazeh achar zeh keman de nafal bevat achat tamei v'ha lechamshin nafla v'ha lechamshin nafla. For Rabbi Shimon savar kamaita batel b'me'ah v'ha tivtil b'me'ah v'chad. But you can't really compare the 2 cases. Why? Because it could be that the machloket between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim is irrelevant to us. Why? Because the rabbis are saying that since 1 sa'ah fell in, and then another sa'ah fell in, and there was no interruption in between, you didn't fix it in between, that means that basically 2 sa'ah fell in. 2 sa'ah fell in. And 2 sa'ah falling into 100 is only 50 to 1. It's not 100 to 1. So it's no good. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, when number 1 fell in, it was nullified in 100. And that one that was nullified becomes part of the permitted thing. And then when the second one falls in, it also becomes nullified in the 101. Alright? So it's really just an argument about the mechanism of nullification. Does the mechanism of nullification happen automatically, even if you didn't do anything in between? We look at the incidents as separate incidents. That's what Rabbi Shimon is saying. And incident 1 happened, nullification. Incident 2 happened, nullification, even though you only come to the scene to fix it after the 2 incidents happened. The Chachamim say we look at it once you come into the picture, now we assess the situation. And the situation is 2 fell in. Okay, that's the way the Chachamim look at it. Now, so that is totally irrelevant to our case. Because that means that nobody is really saying that the piece or the part of Terumah that fell in is separate from the mixture. They're just arguing about when does the nullification take effect. Only when you come on the scene or automatically. So Ella, rather we have to say, Hu de Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So now we have 2 strikes against us. We tried 2 resolutions, we're trying number 3. So the Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar has a nifty concept here, that let's say a person needs to separate terumah from their produce, they have produce in front of them, and they didn't separate terumah yet, and maybe they can't separate it for some reason. He says, you know what? You can in your mind say, that part is going to be terumah over there, I'm going to eat from this part. And mentally designated, and the mental designation is sufficient to satisfy the obligation of separating. So, what does that mean? That means that what could Rabbi Yehuda be saying? Rabbi Yehuda says, since I could do that mentally anyway, right? I could mentally eat from the pot and say, okay, that part of the pot is going to be terumah, I'm just eating from this side of the pot. No problem. So since mentally it would be enough, so then the fact that I'm physically taking it out, I'm not doing anything, it's not a tikkun at all, and therefore it's okay. So, Umi Savar Lekivate, is that really true? Would Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar really agree with this halakha of Rabbi Yehuda that you could do it on Shabbat? Actually, this is a machloket between them. Tanya, as it says in the Braita, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ma'alina Tamiduma Be'achar U'me'ah, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Noten enav b'tzad zeh ve'ochel mitzad acher. It's actually a direct machloket between the two of them. In other words, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar explicitly says, Rabbi Yehuda says, on Shabbat, if you had that 100 of mundane produce and the 1 part terumah, you can actually separate out the 1 part terumah. And Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, no, you can mentally designate the part that you are going to separate for terumah, but you can't actually separate it. So he's not following Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, he's arguing with Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So therefore, what does the Gemara say? Simple resolution now, that the Rabbi Yehuda adifa de Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Basically, Rabbi Yehuda is not disagreeing with Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, but is slightly taking it a step further. He's saying, I agree with you, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, that you can designate it mentally. But because you can designate it mentally, that means that my physical separation is actually not significant. Because since halachically designating it mentally, in other words, if I have the pot here and I'm saying, okay, that part of the pot, that's terumah, I'm just eating from here. I'm eating from this part of it. So since I can do that anyway mentally, I can also just take that part and put it on the side and say it's terumah. What's the difference? I'm doing the same thing mentally, saying I'm not going to eat that part, it's terumah, I'm eating this part. So how does it make a difference? So actually the halakha is not like Rabbi Yehuda, you're not allowed to separate it. But still, the point is that that's what Rabbi Yehuda was saying. He was saying once mentally it's effective, so what difference does it make if I physically move the terumah to the side? So now we come to the next Mishnah. Ha'even she'al pi hachavit mata al tzida v'hi nofelet. If you have a barrel of wine with a rock on top, you can tilt the barrel so that the rock falls out, and that's no problem. Ha'ita ben hachaviyot. If this was a barrel among other barrels, such that if you tilted it and the rock fell, it would break the other barrels, or there's no space to tilt it. So magbia or matal tzida v'hi nofelet. So then you have to pick it up, move it, and then tilt it to the side, because there's no way to move it. There's no way to tilt it where it is now. Ma'ot she'al akar. If you have money that was left on a pillow, mina'eret akar ve'nofalot, you can shake the pillow, the money will fall off. Haytal alav lishleshet. If there was some kind of a dirtiness, Rashi says it could be anything. It could be excrement. It could be any kind of dirtiness on the pillow. So mekanacha b'smartut, you can wipe it off with a rag. Hayta shel or notnin alea mayim ad shetichle. And if it's a leather pillow, then you can put water on it until you remove the the dirtiness. So on cloth, you're not allowed to put water because that's considered like kibus. It's considered washing it. With leather, because leather is not really absorbent to the same level, you're allowed to put water to wipe off the stain, but you're actually not allowed to scrub it with water. That's what the Gemara says elsewhere. But you're allowed to put water to wipe off the stain, lightly wipe off the stain on Shabbat. But if there's something there, if it's cloth, you wouldn't be allowed to put water on that. So now the Gemara takes up the issue here and fleshes out these cases. So Amar Ravuna says, Amar Rav, that Rav says, Lo shenu el b'shocheach, aval b'maniach nasa basis l'davar asur. Now, in general, there's a principle that we know that if something muktzeh, something you're not allowed to handle on Shabbat, such as a rock, is left on top of something which you are allowed to handle on Shabbat and you would like to, but you left it there with the intent of having it there all day, all Shabbat, or at least, for the foreseeable future, you put it there on purpose. So then, some say that means even if you put it there just for Friday night, but you want, or some say you have to have intended for it to stay for the whole Shabbat. Whatever the case may be, you want it to be there. You put it there on purpose. So then, what's under it becomes a base for what's on top. If you left it there by accident, then you're allowed to move the barrel. So what Rav Huna is saying is that in this case of the barrel, if you had put the rock there and said, I'm putting this rock here, and I'm going to leave this rock here. So then, now the barrel becomes a support for the rock. You can't move the barrel now. You can't move the barrel at all, because you made the barrel a base for the rock, because you wanted to leave the rock there. It's not the top of the barrel, you just put the rock on the barrel. Now, if you forgot the rock on the barrel, you didn't mean to leave it there, you put it there for a second and you meant to come get it. So then you can move the barrel in order to tip it to the side and let the rock fall off. Haita ben achaviyot. So we said that if it's among the other barrels, you can move it and then tilt it where you have clear space. So So where did we learn that anytime you have a prohibited thing and a permitted thing, we don't deal directly with the prohibited thing, we deal with the permitted thing instead. So in other words, here in our Mishnah we're saying better to pick up the entire barrel and tilt it so that you don't have to just take the rock off. In other words, what would be the easier thing? Just take the rock off. But no, we don't want to touch the rock, so we move the barrel and we tilt it so that the rock will fall off. Where do we see a precedent for this kind of thinking? Amar Rabbi Bar Chana. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, this comes from the teaching of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Titnan, as we learned in the Mishnah in Masekhet Betzah, Haborer kitnit biyom tov, when you are separating. Now, borer on Shabbat is not allowed. You're not allowed to separate impurities from a food on Shabbat. Okay? Now, on Yom Tov, you're allowed to. So you have beans, and you want to separate the impurities because it's food preparation. You're allowed to do it. So, Beit Shammai omrim borer ochel ve'ochel. You're allowed to take only ochel. You're allowed to take the food ve'ochel and eat it, just like you would do on Shabbat. You're allowed to take what you want to eat and eat it, but you're not allowed to take what you don't want out. Same as Shabbat. Beit Hillel omrim borer kedarko bechaiko uvtamchui. And Beit Hillel says you can do it normally. You can do it on your shirt, like if you use your shirt to sift out. They would sometimes hold their shirt like this and shake it so they could sift out the impurities. Or you could use a plate to shift it, to tilt it to clean out the impurities. You're allowed to do that. Whatever the normal way is of purifying this kind of thing. But the Tanya, and we learned in a Braita, Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel b'med dvarim amurim she'ochel merubeh ala pesolet, aval pesolet merubah ala ochel, divrei hakol borer ochel. So he says, it depends. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel comes along, and this is actually the halacha. He says, when the food is more than the impurity, so what's it easier to do? Take out the impurities, obviously, because there's less impurity. When there's more of impurities mixed in there and there's just a little bit of food, so then it's easier to take the food out. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says whatever's easier. In other words, if the food is more than the pisolet, but if there's more impurity than there is food, even Beit Shammai will tell you should take the food rather than the impurity. Because, I'm sorry, the other way around. Even Beit Hillel is going to say that you have to take the food rather than the impurity. Because it's more effort to take out the junk than to take out the good.
And that's the halacha?
Yeah, that is the halacha, yeah.
Why do we have to take the food?
No, we're talking about Yom Tov.
Oh.
This is only Yom Tov. On Shabbat, you have to take the food. On Yom Tov, it's different. On Yom Tov, we go with whatever's easier. So if what's easier, if there's more food, definitely you take out the impurities. If there's more impurity, you take the food.
I'm sorry, but I don't understand the whole business of the barrel with the rock. Why would we want to move the barrel for something other than getting rid of the rock? What could we do with the barrel?
Oh, it has wine in it.
I understand.
Yeah, you want wine. But rather than...
I guess I'm not picturing.
So there's a rock sitting on top of the barrel cover.
An open barrel?
No, let's say the barrel's closed.
Okay.
And there's a rock on it. Somebody left their wallet on it. I don't know, whatever. It could be anything.
Okay.
So rather than take the wallet off, you tilt it so that the wallet falls off.
Right.
Or the rock falls off.
Right.
And then you open up the barrel and drink out of it. So he's saying it would have been easier, you'd think, to just take the wallet off. Right? But you don't do that. You don't deal with we try to only handle what's permitted rather than what's forbidden whenever we can. So that's why he's saying here that Rabban Shimon Gamliel is saying when it's easier, we always go with taking the food. Even Beit Hillel that allows you to take the pesolet, that allows you to take the impurities out of the food on Yom Tov, even he'll agree that if the impurities are greater than the amount of food, you should take the food. So we always lean towards taking the food. But the Gemara says that's not true though. Because in our case, the ki ochel mirubeh ala pesolet tameh. Our case is actually similar to the case where the food is greater than the pesolet, right? Where there's more food than there is impurity, dame, because the rock is just one thing. You're picking up the entire barrel just to move the rock. So it's the opposite. Hachaname deiba ele mishkal la mishtakel leyayin adashakil la even kapsol miruba ala ochel dame. So the question is like this: that it would seem actually that this proof disproves us, right? Because it should be easier to take the rock off. So Rabban Shimon Gamliel is saying you go with what's easier. And when it's easier to take the impurities out of the food, rather than take the food out of the impurities, so to speak, so you take the impurities out of the food on Yom Tov. So here, you should take the rock off of the barrel. That's easier than moving the entire barrel and then tilting it to get the rock off. It's more effort. So he says that no, since you can't really get the wine out unless you take the rock off, it's like a case where the rock is greater than the food. Okay, so Rashi says on the side here, what does Rashi say? That if you wanted to take all the wine out, you're going to have to pick up the entire barrel anyway. Okay, and therefore we look at it as a case where I'll read you from Rashi. He says, "L'chulei yayin min hachavit lo mishtakel leyayin shebeshulea ad shakil u'magbala lachavit kepsolet merubeh dameh di betchilato lo magbala lachavit sof sof miba'el l'agboa." So tu lachavit hilka chavelei mapish batircha. He says, since in the end you're going to have to move the barrel anyway, because how are you going to get what's on the bottom of the barrel? You're going to have to move it into a place where you can tilt it to get the rest of to get the rest of it out in any case. So he says that similarly here, you're going. So therefore, it's considered a case where you're really you have to deal with the food and not with the impurity, because even if you could take the rock off of the top of the barrel without tilting it, without moving the barrel, the fact is you're going to have to move the barrel in the end anyway. So now you're doing two separate actions. You're going to end up taking the rock off the barrel to get what's on the top of the barrel, but then when you need what's on the bottom of the barrel, you're going to have to move it anyway. So it's a situation where it's less problematic to just move the entire barrel, tilt it, let the rock fall off, and now you also have the barrel out, so you can take the entirety of the contents of the barrel. So it's actually more convenient to do that than to take the rock off. That's step one, take what you can, and then move the barrel again to get what's at the bottom of the barrel. So actually, in the end, it ends up being more efficient, more cost-effective, if you will, more efficient to simply do one thing, move the barrel, and allow the rock to fall off along the way. So that's the way that the Gemara works this out. So now, Haita ben Chaviyot Magbiat, so Tanya Rabbi Yossi Omer, Haita Chavit Munachat Ba'otzar, או שהיו כלי זכוכית מונחים תחתיה, מגביה למקום אחר ומטל צידה, והיא נופלת, ונוטל ממנה מה שצריך לו, ומחזירה למקומה. This is really just a further explication of what it says in our Mishnah, which is that if this barrel that we're talking about is among other barrels in a storehouse, or there are glass vessels sitting around it such that if you tilt it and allow the rock to fall, it will smash them. So that's the case case where you pick it up and you move it to another place. You tilt it, v'hinofelet, and the rock will fall, and then you take whatever you need from it, and then you can even put it back in its original place. So ma'ot shalakar, we said that if there is money sitting on the pillow, you can tilt the pillow and allow the money to fall off. Again, this is only talking about where you left the money there by accident. If you put it there on purpose, now you made the pillow a stand for the money. You made the pillow muktzeh in its own right. Actually, the truth is that that's only the case where you want to use the pillow. You want to use the pillow. So if you want to use the pillow and you left the money on it, so you tilt the pillow and allow the money to fall off. If you wanted to use the pillow and you left the money on it on purpose, you can't, because you made the pillow muqtzeh. But if you want to use the place where the pillow is sitting, then even if you left the money on there on purpose, you'd be allowed to move it, because you're allowed to move a totally muqtzeh thing for its place. So you would be allowed to move it anyway. And similarly, did Rabbi Chia bar Rav from Difti say, you can move the pillow even with the money on it if your objective is to move it from one place to another in order to get it out of the way, because you need the space underneath it. So now we said that if the money is on the pillow, you can shake the pillow to get the money off. Reb Oshaya said, let's say you left your wallet out in the courtyard. Now you want to move the wallet because you don't want to lose the money, right? You don't want to lose your money. You left your wallet out in the courtyard. Courtyard is a semi-public place, so it's fenced around, but all the people in the courtyard have access to that area, and you want to be able to move it to a secure place. So maniach alea kikar tinok umetaltala. What do? You put a kikar, a loaf of bread, on your wallet. Or you put a child sit on your wallet, and now you use the wallet as a tray to carry something permitted. In other words, it's the reverse of a basis, the reverse of making something a base for something you're not allowed to carry. You make it a base for something you're allowed to carry, now you can carry it. So you can only do that in these exceptional circumstances. Let's say you left a brick out in the courtyard, and it's a valuable brick, you don't want to lose it. Similarly, you put either a kikar, a loaf of bread, or a tinok, or you put a baby on it, and you use it now as a base to carry the permitted thing. Amar Rabbi Yehuda bar Shela, Amar Rabbi Asi, Pam achat shachachu diskiya mele'a ma'ot bisratya. Once it happened, Rabbi Yehuda bar Shela said that Rabbi Asi said that once it happened that they left a bag full of money in a public place and on Shabbat. Now, a public place, to begin with, you have the problem of carrying from a public to a private domain, but you also have the problem of muqtzeh. So what are you going to do about Rabbi Yochanan? And they came and asked Rabbi Yochanan. Fa'amar lan, and he said to them, Hanichu alea kikarotinok v'taltiloa. Put on it a baby or a loaf of bread, and you can move it. Make it a base for something else, and you can move it since it's an emergency. Now, what about the fact that they're carrying in a public domain? So Rashi says either they would move it, what's called pachot midalid amot. In an emergency situation, one is allowed to move something in a public domain less than 4 amot at a time, less than 6 feet at a time. You move it a little bit, you stop. You move it a little bit, you stop. You move it a little bit, and you stop. You're not normally supposed to do that. But in an emergency case of major loss, major monetary loss, you're allowed to do it. That's actually what the last perek of Masekhet Shabbat is about. A case where somebody gets stranded and he's going to lose all his possessions, and moving it little by little. It talks about the idea of moving it little by little. It recommends getting someone else who's a non-Jewish to carry it for you. But it talks about this idea of moving things less than 4 amot at a time. The other possibility is that you can make a human wall, so that you have a fence around you and you can carry it, and the human wall will walk with you on your way home. But either way, these are extraordinary measures for extenuating circumstances. In any case, Amar Marzutra said, that we follow these halachot. If somebody forgot something, in all these cases we permit it, but only if you forgot it. You can't rely on this in the first case. You can't say, I'm going to leave my wallet out there and I'll just put a loaf of bread on it tomorrow. Rav Ashi Amar afilu shachachnami lo. Rav Ashi says that's not true. We don't allow it at all. Velo amru kikar otinok ela lamet bilvad. The only time they allowed you to move something muktzeh on Shabbat, using this trick of putting a loaf of bread on it, was when you needed to move a dead body on Shabbat. Because of kavod amet, for some reason, for honor of the dead, they allowed you. Abaye manach kapa akipe, Rava manach sakina abaryona, umtaltala. Abaye once put a spoon on some straw in order to move it on Shabbat. Rava put a knife on a bar yonah, a dove, a dead dove that was for eating, but it wasn't cooked. It was a raw dove in order to move it on Shabbat. These are both muktzeh things that they put a non-muktzeh thing on top of it in order to move it.
But didn't they have to move the dead dove or the knife or the spoon?
It was the spoon is not muktzeh and the knife is not muktzeh.
Yeah,
so they put the knife on top of the dove. No, in a courtyard. We're assuming it was out there. Yeah. So Amar Rav Yosef said, "Kama charifa shmatata d'dardikei." How sharp is the teaching of these young scholars? He was being sarcastic. He was saying they're wrong. Why? Emar da'amur rabbanan b'shocheach lechatchila mi'amur. Did the rabbis allow you to do this? Lechatchila? They only said you could use this kind of trick if you forgot something and it was an emergency, but they were doing it as a common, as a matter of course. Amar Abai says, "Ilav dadam chashuvana kapa kipe lamali hachazul mizgalayu." Amar Rava ana ilav dadam chashuvana sakina abar yona lamali hachazil lumtza. So Abaye said, if I weren't such an important person, meaning if people weren't watching my every move and learning from it, do you think I would have put a spoon on top of straw in order to carry it? I don't need to, because straw could be used in order to sit on it. It could be used as a seat. I just went out of my way to put, and these are bundles of straw, in other words, that could be used as a seat. I just put a spoon on there so people won't make any inference. They'll see that I'm doing it in an unusual way by putting a spoon on it, and they won't come to be really liberal about muktzeh because they watched me. And similarly, Rava said, if I were not such an important person that people were watching me, why would I put a knife on a dove in order to move it? I wouldn't have to, because a dove could be eaten raw. We're talking about a kosher thing. It could be eaten raw. So why would I need to put a knife on it? I just did it because if people see me moving a dove on Shabbat, they're going to say, oh, you can move anything on Shabbat. Look, Rava is doing it. It must be okay. So I have to do this in order to avoid the wrong perception. Now we notice another thing about Rava, which is he mentioned that you can eat it raw. Which implies that if it were not capable of being eaten raw, even Rava would not allow you to move it on Shabbat. Meat that can't be eaten raw would not be allowed to be moved. Which means that Rava follows Rabbi Yehuda. But didn't Rava once say, cook me up a nice goose on Yom Tov and throw the intestines to the animals, to the cat? Now, why is that significant? Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, if you had an animal from before Yom Tov, and that animal was designated for human consumption, you now can't give part of it to an animal. Because it was designated for human consumption, it's only allowed to be used for human consumption. It's muktzeh for any other use. You can't throw the intestines to the cat. So what do you see though? On one hand, on Shabbat, it sounds like Rava is saying that that meat can only be moved on Shabbat if it's edible in its current state to a human being, implying that even though it's edible, let's say, to a cat, you wouldn't be allowed to move it. Whereas on Yom Tov, he's saying, cook me up a goose and throw the intestines to the cat, implying that you can redesignate from human use to animal use, and it shouldn't be an issue. So the Gemara says, we move to Kuf Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, Hatam Kevan de Masrach Date Ilave Me'etmol. So the reason is that over there, since he knew he was going to use this goose for his lunch on Yom Tov, and he knew that if he left the intestines around for after Yom Tov, since they weren't normally eaten by people as part of a real fine meal, they wouldn't use it. They would throw it usually to the animals. Since he knew that, he was planning from the beginning to throw the intestines to the animals. It was the plan from the beginning. So, and moreover, it makes sense that Rava is consistent here in following Rabbi Yehuda, that something on Shabbat, he would only recognize a food designated for a human being as not muktzeh because if it's edible to a human being. Okay, and on Yom Tov, the only reason why he allowed the intestine to be thrown to the cat was because from the beginning he knew it was only edible for the cat. Okay, and we see that he's consistent in this way. The Darash Rava, because Rava said, that a woman cannot go into the firewood where they stored firewood to take a piece of wood to use as a stick for, let's say, cooking. She can't use that. we're not talking about burning the stick. We're talking about, like, let's say, stoking the charcoal or something like that. She can't do that. Ve'ud shenishbar, and if she has a stick for stoking charcoal, and it breaks, asur lahasiko b'yom tov, she cannot redesignate it for firewood. In other words, what it's designated for is what it has to stay. Because you can use kelim, you can use vessels for firewood, but you can't use broken vessels for firewood, and therefore we conclude that really whatever the designation is that something has from before Shabbat or before Yom Tov, that determines what its range of use is on Shabbat or Yom Tov, and whatever a person has in mind is what it's going to be defined as. So in this case, that's what Rava was saying. When he had in mind for a certain purpose, or when the woman had in mind before Yom Tov, that was firewood. Now all of a sudden you need a stick. Nope, you can't do it. Oh, that was a stick. Now all of a sudden you want to make it firewood? You can't do it because now it's no longer functional for the original purpose it had, which was to serve as a stick. Now you could throw, let's say, something which was not which is a vessel into the fire on Yom Tov. You're allowed to do that, but you're not allowed to take a vessel that breaks on Yom Tov and use it as firewood because its original designation was for something else. Now, the halakha actually comes out that the bottom line here is that you can't use this trick of putting a non-muktzeh thing onto a muktzeh thing and carrying the muktzeh thing, except in the case of kivod hamet, except when it's being done for respect of the dead, for some reason that the dead body has to be moved on Shabbat and it's muktzeh, obviously. But in other cases, we don't allow this trick, this strategy, to be used for other purposes. Even if somebody forgot something, the halakha in Shulchan Aruch is that you cannot, in order to move it, you cannot use this trick of putting the non-muktzeh item on it and transporting it.